It's Thursday, September 7th, 2017, and this is Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur / 3000 NFL Mock Draft with Kenneth Arthur and Rob Staton. And I am the former part of that sentence, the Kenneth Arthur, not the Seaside Chats or the 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Kenneth Arthur. And with me again, he's back again. The tag team's back again. Kenneth Arthur and Rob Staton from the BBC and Seahawks-Draftblog.com has come back to join me for another episode of 3000 NFL Mock Draft, where we can talk about college football, the 2018 NFL Draft. We'll talk about some of the prospects coming up in that, including the quarterbacks and the QB watch of this class that's supposed to be so fantastic next year, with some of those guys at the top and who will be the number one pick, or will it be a quarterback at all? And we'll talk about that. And then later on, we're going to talk about the Seattle Seahawks as they prepare for their Week 1 game against the Green Bay Packers in Lambeau Field. The Seahawks adding Sheldon Richardson just before the year, which of course is heightening the excitement for this team right now. And so to talk about the Green Bay Packers, stay tuned in the second half for my talk with comedian Josh Simpson of the Meet podcast, and we're going to talk about the Green Bay Packers and growing up with Brett Favre and the Aaron Rodgers era and so forth. So stay tuned for that. And myself and Rob, we're going to talk about the Seahawks and Packers and a short outlook perhaps on the 2017 season. But we're going to begin with a little bit of college football talk. Rob, first of all, it's so good to hear your voice again, as I'm about to in a minute. Those dulcet British tones that I've missed so much over these last few months, and I think how much others and the listeners have missed it as well. They don't like to just hear my voice. That is a fact, and they like to hear the opinions of someone who is so bright and smart and knowledgeable about the NFL and the college game. So, Rob, it's great to have you back.
No, it's great to be back. There's sort of that long, big, boring period of the year, which is, right after the draft finishes, all the way up until when training camp starts and, you get the preseason games. We finally got that out of the way. We're here. The first Seahawks game on Sunday, the first college football weekend's already complete. It's just a really exciting time. And, I'm looking forward to doing the podcast again this year, Kenny, and hopefully keeping people entertained and sort of bringing some good names to the attention of Seahawks fans that they can watch in the college game.
Yeah, absolutely. And, speaking of, college football, they got their first full week in the books last Saturday. They're going to kick off week 2 this week, of course. And both Washington teams are in the top 20 right now. Washington Huskies, Washington State's at number 20. And Washington, they started off things on Friday night against Rutgers. Jake Browning going 17 of 30 for 284 yards and 2 touchdowns in a 30-14 win at Rutgers for, at the time, number 8 Washington. What were your thoughts on Washington? Did you get a chance to watch that game or just highlights? And, Jake Browning is a guy that, nearly won the Heisman last year and isn't being talked about in the circles that I've been listening to too much, as much this year. And I don't know if that's just me or if that's just because some of the other candidates are just outperforming or just have higher expectations a little bit. But as far as Washington and Jake Browning, what did you see?
Well, I did see the game, and I think that, firstly on Jake Browning, I think the problem that he's going to have in terms of the NFL is that he has some limitations physically. He's not sort of the type of guy, and I don't think the expectation ever was that he was going to, suddenly develop a really strong arm or become really mobile or anything like that. He is of a similar physical standard to someone like Mason Rudolph, really, in that he can operate the offense. He is very accomplished in sort of running that offense, but when it gets to the next level and you've got to fit a pass, down the seam into a tight window, or you've got to, really drill a ball in there, to the sideline, he's going to have some issues with that, and that's going to limit what he is as an NFL passer. Now, that's not to say that he's not going to have an NFL career. He could easily have that. But this is going to be a draft that is I'm sure we'll come on to this in a minute, but this is going to be a draft that is dominated by quarterbacks. There's been a lot of that talk over the last few weeks, and I think some of it is very, very accurate. Some of it's maybe a little bit, there's a bit of too much hype with some guys and not enough hype with others. We'll come on to that in a minute, but Jake Browning's, he's going to find it difficult to get amongst sort of the top 4 or 5 quarterbacks in this class. As for Washington in general, I think that the best thing about them from that game was the way that Vita Vea and Greg Gaines played at defensive tackle. Vea was superb. Gaines is incredibly active. Great motor, keeps going. And they just sort of dominated that game. There was a passage of play right before halftime when Rutgers got those 2 guys off the field. I think they sort of put the lighter defensive tackles on the field because it was a hurry-up offense. And Rutgers just ran the ball straight at the next 2 guys up and got about 10 yards. Hurry-up offense, ran again, another 12 yards, ran again, got another 10 yards. And before you knew it, they were at halfway. And then just before the 2-minute warning, Washington was able to sub Vea and Gaines back into onto the field, and the drive just completely stalled there and then. They couldn't do anything. Their ability to shut down the running game, their ability to create problems, to handle the offensive line of Rutgers was really good to see. Vea's got the potential to be a top 15 pick this year because he's kind of got that Haloti Ngata type of frame and athleticism, and he's the kind of strongest guy on the field type of player. But I think Gaines is underrated. He's a player that he's not going to go in the first round. He's probably not going to be anywhere near Vea's terms of upside. But he's just one of those guys that you could imagine him being like a mid-round pick and sticking in the NFL and having a really good, understated career. So I think these are 2 guys at Washington that are really worth looking at. I think if there was one big disappointment from the Washington game, it was perhaps the left tackle Trey Adams had a really difficult time handling the Rutgers edge rushers. Adams, seen by many as a possible sort of top 20 pick, and I thought he could do that this year as well. That wasn't a great start from him. It's don't want to overreact to it. Maybe that will act as a bit of a wake-up call or will motivate him to improve over the next few weeks. But he's going to have to do a lot better than that if he's going to think about declaring at the end of the year.
The big game of the weekend was number 1 Alabama hosting number 3 Florida State. And while that's a tough order for task at any team to go into Alabama in week 1, Florida State goes in, they lose 24-7, but on the bright side, I guess if there is one, it's if you lose in any game at any point, let it be to number 1 Alabama in the first week. It gives them plenty of time to get back into the national championship hunt. But in terms of Alabama winning 24-7 against Florida State, number 3 in the nation, how strong do they look right now, or unbeatable do they look right now? And in terms of Florida State, they have a top 5 prospect in safety Derwin James. What are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, I like James. He missed most of last year, so it was hard to see if he'd made any real progress since his freshman year. But he's kind of a complete safety. He's got the size, he delivers the big hits, but he's got range, very athletic. So he's got a chance to go and be a very early pick. He's got to stay healthy, though. He can't have another year which is plagued by injuries. In terms of the game overall, it was very, very close up until halftime. At halftime, I think it was a 3-point game, and Florida State had a field goal blocked just before halftime, which would have tied it up. And then in the second half, you just sort of see that why Alabama are so successful year after year after year. Their depth, their ability to rotate guys into the defensive line, to stay fresher than the other team, to just keep going longer and longer because they've just got so much strength in depth. They've got guys who are maybe like 3rd or 4th, 5th on the depth chart at defensive tackle who would be, absolute studs for most of the teams in the country. And they're rotating these guys in. They play about 10% of the snaps because they can just sort of go in and out and mix things up. So that kind of ability to endure better than most teams was what did for Florida State. And they just completely shut them down in the second half, and it turned into an absolute pasting. Florida State lost their quarterback, Francois, to, I think it's a season-ending knee injury in the second half as well. Do Alabama look Alabama look like they kind of always look, which is you see them play like this and you think they're going to go undefeated and win the national title. But the great thing about college football is that it does sort of throw up these unpredictable moments. And, who would have thought that Alabama would have those 2 losses against Ole Miss over the years? Who would have thought that, having been in a position to win the national title last year, that they would end up losing it to Clemson and sort of throwing it away? So, it's hard to say that they're going to be unbeatable this year, but they certainly, for me, look a pretty safe prediction to win the national championship at this stage.
Well, let's get talking to what you teased a minute ago with the quarterback situation in college football and the 2018 NFL draft. Certainly, there are names bandied about for that number one spot, from Josh Allen to Josh Rosen to Sam Darnold at USC, and then 2016, Heisman winner Lamar Jackson at Louisville. You have a piece up at SeahawksDraftBlog.com, talking about Lamar Jackson as in depth. And this weekend, Louisville goes to Purdue and wins 35-28 with Jackson throwing for 378 yards and 2 touchdowns, rushing for 107 yards. Funnily enough, Louisville moved down a spot in the AP for their 7-point win over Purdue. Apparently not strong enough for a top 20 team at Purdue. But in terms of Lamar Jackson, not only doing what was been considered impossible in recent decades, which is to win 2 Heisman trophies, but in terms of his NFL prospects, what are you seeing out of Lamar Jackson?
A lot of good things. I mean, last year, the problem that he had in terms of projecting him to be a potential NFL quarterback is that he had all the physical skills, but as a passer, he was kind of one-paced. It was kind of 100-mile-an-hour fastball or nothing. So whether he was sort of throwing it short or downfield, he would basically throw it as hard as he could, and there wasn't much evidence of being able to throw with touch. He made life a bit difficult for his receivers sometimes, and he threw absolute bullets towards them. So what you wanted to sort of see in his set, he was only a 1-year starter last year, so you kind of going to say, okay, well, he's still got time to develop. And in this first game against Purdue, he has shown that he's taken the next step, in my opinion. It looks as if he's going to take the next step this year. He was doing things in that game that he wasn't doing last year, which was he would scramble away from pressure, would move away out of the pocket, and rather than just get his head down and try and run because he's got the potential to run for 80 yards if he needs to, he was looking downfield and throwing with great touch and accuracy. And he just did this time and time again. He was throwing down the seam. He was throwing slants. He was throwing downfield. He was just doing everything that you want to see. It was pretty much a complete performance from him. He still ran for 100 yards, but it wasn't, it didn't feel like a forced 100 yards. It was almost like it was just, when Russell Wilson runs for sort of 70, 80 yards, it's kind of a compliment to the passing that he does. And that's what it felt with Lamar Jackson in this game. He looked like he had really taken a next step. And it's not a big surprise because he's, his head coach, Bobby Petrino, hasn't put many really great quarterbacks into the NFL, but he is a good coach. And this could be his best project so far because Lamar Jackson has got the physical tools to be an absolute superstar. And with the right kind of coaching that he's going to get with Petrino and sort of be able to, Petrino's a very disciplined coach and will get him sort of working on the fine tuning of details within his game. I think he's setting himself up to be a potential really early pick next year. Now he could stay in school. He could declare, I think if he wins 2 Heismans, for example, he wins the Heisman again this year, there isn't really much else for him to achieve in college, so he might consider to turn pro. And while everybody's talking about people like Josh Allen and Josh Rosen and Sam Darnold, with good reason in some cases, I mean, I watched Sam Darnold as well against Western Michigan, and I thought, despite the fact he had 2 interceptions in that game, I thought it was a really strong performance by Sam Darnold and kind of showed why he's been tipped to be a potential number 1 pick. Didn't think as much of Josh Allen and even Josh Rosen with that great comeback. There were some things that maybe we'll discuss in a moment that I didn't really like about his performance. But for me, I think that a tentative ranking of based on what we've, seeing how players have progressed from last year to this year based on the one game at the weekend and to sort of monitor it as it goes along, I think that my rankings would be Darnold 1, Jackson 2, Rosen 3. In terms of the quarterbacks. But Lamar Jackson has got a legitimate chance to be a pro quarterback. If he continues the development that he showed in that game against Purdue, then he has got a really good chance to be a high pick.
Yeah, well, you said it'd be hard not to talk about UCLA's comeback. It was, I didn't personally watch the game, but I did get, text messages later on just saying like, I can't believe what just happened. And then, I had to watch the highlights 4 or 5 different times from different outlets just to see everything that could possibly be seen about that fourth quarter as the comeback from a 34-point deficit for UCLA to pull out the win with Josh Rosen. Obviously, his numbers were fantastic and the comeback was fantastic. And and he's drawing praise for everything that you could say, especially for a guy that's, young, and people said had their questions about his experience, whether or not it was okay for him at this point to be considered a number one pick because of non-success stories that were projected early on in their freshman year, like Matt Barkley and so on and so forth. But, you sort of said that you didn't love everything about that game from Josh Rosen, which I'm totally I think that some of the highlights, I did see Josh Rosen make plays that seemed more so fortunate than skillful. What were your thoughts on Rosen?
I think the first thing to say is that Rosen looks every bit like he's going to be an NFL quarterback one day, and has got every chance to be a pretty decent NFL quarterback at that as well. I mean, look, the league just wants players to come in and be able to win games. And you look at Rosen, you look at Darnold, you look at Jackson, you look at Josh Allen to an extent, and you can imagine them all winning games in the NFL. So first things first, has got a legitimate chance to be a decent NFL quarterback. And in this performance, there were things to like. Some nice throws down the seam. He threw underneath an awful lot in the game, but did it effectively and was willing to take what the defense would give him. The last touchdown that he throws is very good. The faking the spike and then throwing it with great accuracy into a place where only the receiver could get it. On the final TD drive, he split two defenders down the seam, which was this really incredible throw. That's the type of throw that, as an NFL scout, you sort of go into the GM or the head coach and you're going, look at this, this is why we should consider drafting this guy in like the top 10 or 15 picks, because of that quality of throw, the accuracy, the arm strength was there. It is needed, Kenny, for this miracle comeback, because let's not kid around here. Texas A&M absolutely blew this game. I have no idea what they were doing on defense. It was just a shambles. The first touchdown that Josh Rosen threw is just an extended handoff to the receiver. He just sort of throws it out to the sideline. And it's a terrible missed tackle by the cornerback, and he just sort of walks in for a touchdown. So hard to really give anybody credit for that. The second touchdown is thrown right into the hands of the defensive back. It's an underthrown deep ball, and it somehow goes through the hands of the defensive back. It doesn't even tip the ball. It just goes straight through his hands and is miraculously caught by the wide receiver, who just sort of, waltzes into the end zone. The third touchdown, he's under pressure. He sort of scrambles out to the left-hand side. He throws it up for grabs because he's under pressure, and the wide receiver, in fairness, makes a play on the ball. He had two near missed interceptions. A defender dropped a throw. On the final game-winning drive, he kind of has this odd sidearm throw that was tipped up into the air, and somehow nobody picked it off. So I think the best way to describe the game is that Rosen played like a quarterback with absolutely nothing to lose in that fourth quarter. So he was taking plenty of risks, taking lots of shots. And it was one of those days when every single bounce of the ball went his way. Every near turnover didn't end up in a turnover. Every Hail Mary came off. Every shot that he took came off. And he will never have a game like that ever again. So while you do have to give him some credit for the turnaround, and he made some nice throws and showed off what he can do, I think that Texas A&M played a huge part in that comeback, and they should be embarrassed by what they put on.
Yeah, and just that's interesting, because what it makes me think of is also sort of a transition to talking about the NFL, which makes me think of if you have this many quarterback prospects that have a good shot at and maybe becoming a franchise quarterback prospect in next year's draft, even if two of these guys pan out and that they look like top two picks. I mean, yes, there's a chance that the Jets, Jaguars, and 49ers are all picking in the top three and they can get their quarterback. But it does seem to be setting up potentially for more mega trades before the draft next year. If there are two quarterbacks that are franchise quarterbacks, because it's like, you can look at the Colts. What if the Colts have the worst record in the NFL? I could see that happening. And then the Andrew Luck, they're going to trade down. What if it's the Bears? They're not going to take another quarterback this soon with Ryan Pace if they're the worst team in the NFL. There are certainly, I think, some teams that I could see falling flat on their faces that also wouldn't be in a position to necessarily draft a quarterback. Would the Rams be, if they went 2-14 and Jared Goff, are they ready to to bypass a quarterback at this point if it came down to it next year. And I don't know what this discussion leads to or if there's anywhere it goes to, but it's just interesting to think about at this point that maybe there are some trades setting up next year.
Yeah, the other thing is that if Kirk Cousins is a free agent, one of those teams with a terrible record. I know he's been sort of heavily linked with reunited with Kyle Shanahan in San Francisco. If he leaves Washington and signs for a team that's picking in the top 5, for example, then that team in the top 5 might be open to trading out because they don't need a quarterback either. So, that's another dynamic which could lead to big trades. Yeah,
totally. So I mean, if there was one last thing that you wanted to talk about in terms of the college football first week before moving on to the Seahawks, were there any players that stood out to you that you hadn't haven't talked about that much, or were surprised and you're going to be taking a closer look at in the coming weeks in terms of next year's draft?
Yeah, there was a few. First of all, Josh Allen, who is, the Wyoming quarterback. A lot of people have written about him being potentially the number 1 overall pick. And, even watching the Wyoming Iowa game, Matt Millen was one of the the commentators in the booth, and they spent the whole of the first half just sort of going, oh, this is what makes him grow. Every time he completed a pass, oh, amazing. And, talking about how brilliant he was. There's no doubt that Josh Allen has got great arm strength, but as a decision making, accuracy, major question marks there. He's basically a strong arm quarterback who doesn't have the supporting cast, doesn't have great players surrounding him. But I find it really hard to put him above people like Sam Darnold and Lamar Jackson and Josh Rosen at the moment. In terms of players that have stood out that I wasn't sort of thinking about in the past, there's a couple of players who came up against each other at the weekend. One's called Kendall Sheffield. He's a cornerback at Ohio State. He was at Alabama initially, then he went to the JUCOs with Blinn, and then he's at Ohio State now. The one, he's decently sized. He's 6'1", 185 pounds, seems to have decent length. The good thing about him is that he, a bit like when Eli Apple was at Ohio State, does not get beaten over the top, keeps everything in front of him, really tight coverage. And the guy that he was coming up against is a guy called Simmie Cobbs Jr. At Indiana, who gave as good as he got. There was plays where Kendall Sheffield got the better of him and got a hand to the ball, batted it away. And there were plays where Simmie Cobbs Jr. just sort of went up and high pointed the football and just took it away, even though the coverage was good. Now, Cobbs Jr. is he's 6'4", 220 pounds. He's not going to create separation at that size unless he's Mike Evans, and he's not Mike Evans. So he's going to have to win with the contested passes and stuff like that. He had 11 catches for 149 yards and a touchdown and just looked really good. Now, over the last few years, there's been a lot of Indiana players who've looked good in college, and then when they've got to the next level, I think Jordan Howard's the only one who's really sort of had an impact on the NFL. So there's a little bit of a, you start to become a bit suspicious of players who come from a certain college when that's happening. But I think that Simmie Cobbs Jr. is certainly somebody that we should take a look at, because with the Seahawks and all of these receiver debates at the moment, Curse has gone now. Who knows what's going to happen to Paul Richardson? He's a free agent. We need to see what Tyler Lockett does. Whether Tanner McAvoy and Amara Darboh can step up this year. Receiver could be a position that the Seahawks look at next year. So someone like Simmie Cobbs Jr. with that size and high pointing ability that they like could be one to keep an eye on, and keep an eye on Kendall Sheffield as well, the cornerback at Ohio State.
All right. And speaking of the Seahawks and moving some of their potential needs, we know about their needs going into last year's draft. So as the Seahawks prepare to open up their 2017 season, they went 4-0 in the preseason, which is all nice and well. But, more importantly, added Sheldon Richardson, and I think got some encouraging performances from some of the young players as they transition on some of these positions and starting positions as well. So we haven't really spoken over the summer, Rob, and we haven't had a chance over the podcast to talk about training camp and preseason. So it'll give us a good opportunity here in the next 20 minutes to sort of talk about what your expectations are for the Seahawks based on what you've seen in training camp and preseason, and the depth chart after final cuts were made last week. And we can just easily start with the rookies and the new young players, perhaps, that are moving into bigger positions on offense. So that would include Ethan Posick, who at this time we may not see a lot of in the early going. as well as undrafted free agent Jordan Ruth, both those guys on the offensive line, third-round pick Amara Darboh, and rookie running back Chris Carson, who made all the headlines. So in addition to those guys, as well as left tackle Reese Adiambo and receiver Tanner McAvoy, what are your early thoughts so far on the rookies and second-year players on offense?
Well, I have to say I wasn't overly impressed with Ethan Posick, and I think that kind of shows in the way that he's now listed on the depth chart as the backup center, and I don't even think he's not even the backup at either the guard spots or the tackle spots. So I think that with him, yeah, it was great that they saw him as this versatile guy that can play many different positions. But I always kind of assumed that he was a hedge for Justin Britt, who was a pending free agent. But now that they've paid Britt, you kind of wonder where Posick kind of fits into this. Is he ever going to be anything more than just a backup center? Because when he played and he started at guard and a bit of right tackle, I didn't feel like we were watching a player that was going to end up starting at either position as a rookie. And I think that's going to be something to monitor, because that is starting to look like a slightly peculiar pick. But then at the same time, depth on the offensive line and having a guy who can play center at a pinch and then can come in and play guard or tackle if required an emergency. I guess you could argue that's something valuable to have. Chris Carson's been fantastic, hasn't he? I'm not saying anything that people haven't seen themselves. Runs tough, seems to have an ability catching the ball, looks like he's got the potential to be that kind of all-round running back, a bit like we see with David Johnson at Arizona, the ability to catch passes, run tough up the gut, be a red zone threat. So hopefully he's going to get a chance during the season. I think Naz Jones has looked really, really good.
Quickly on Chris Carson and on the offense, did you have any evaluation? I mean, obviously we talked about it after the draft, but that was a while ago for our listeners and myself. Did you have any evaluation on Chris Carson headed into the draft? And can you just sort of maybe refresh people on why he was a 7th-round pick if he looks so good?
Yeah, I think there was sort of different things, really. I think the first time that he kind of came to mind was if you look through the drafts over the last few years, the Seahawks have always drafted the same physical type of running back. They've all been about 5'10" to 6 foot. They've all been about 225 pounds. They've all been, explosive players, but not necessarily fast. So you're looking at guys with good vertical jump, good broad jump, powerful guys, explosive guys, but not people running a 4.4. They're more likely they could run in the 4.5s and it's not an issue. And, you can run back, and nearly every running back they've drafted has fit this exact same criteria. So when you've got that much back history of evidence of what they look for, you then sort of run down the combine list and say, okay, who matches up with what they've looked for? And in 2016, there was about 4 players, one of which was CJ Procise. So we were able to focus on him, and they ended up drafting him in round 3. And then this year, there was, again, about 4 or 5 running backs who fit the profile. If that, it might even have been less than that. And Chris Carson was on the list. I think Brian Hill, the guy at Wyoming, was one of the running backs on the list. Chris Carson was on the list. So immediately then you sort of say, okay, well, let's look at a little closer at these guys. And when you look at the Oklahoma State tape, there were some things to like. He ran with toughness. He showed everything at Oklahoma State that we've seen in preseason for the Seahawks here. So why did he go in round 7? I think part of the issue was that he's had some injuries in his career. Part of the issues was that he basically just had one full season of production. They didn't really have him doing that much in the passing game, if memory serves, and he's not got that sort of breakaway speed. And there was one other issue, was that apparently he wasn't running tough enough early in his career, and the Oklahoma State coaches essentially called him out on it and said, listen, you're not going to make it as a running back at any level unless you start playing a little tougher. And he seemed to take that to heart and then showed tremendous steps forward. And I think when Pete Carroll actually did the conference call with Chris Carson when they drafted him, I think he made reference to that, and I can't remember the exact words, but it was kind of like saying, look, you've been there before, you have to run tough or something like that. And it was interesting to sort of hear that felt like something that Carroll had reminded him about. And since he's come to the Seahawks, he has run tough, he has been physical. He didn't fumble the ball once for Oklahoma State. He's not fumbled in preseason for the Seahawks. Seems like a guy that they really like and they can trust. And it's just a case of I think if he gets an opportunity, Kenny, I think I think it might be tough to get the job off him. I think it's just whether or not he's going to get an opportunity with Rawls and Precise and Lacey all seemingly set to be healthy for this Green Bay game, and having to divvy out the snaps because there's essentially 4 guys they seem to really like.
Yeah. And what about just because before moving into the defense a little bit, but Reese Adiyambo, obviously people want to know more about. Who would have thought that going into this year, the 3rd round pick in 2016 that is the most important to Seattle right now is Reese Adiyambo, and not CJ Prosise, though he may still have the brightest future of the 3, and certainly not Nick Vannett, the tight end. What were your thoughts on Reese Adiyambo as he came in to take the place of George Fant?
Well, do you know what? I watched the San Diego. I watched the Los Angeles Chargers game and thought that Odhiambo was fantastic at left guard. And then I think whether it was Carroll or Cable spoke afterwards, and they were like a bit inconsistent. And yet, I watched every play that he had in that game and thought, wow, he looks really good at left guard. And then he seemed to not be considered at all for that job, which I was a little bit surprised about. And then Fant went down, and again they were kind of lukewarm about Odhiambo, and he had some bad plays in the Minnesota game, I think, when he came in. So there was kind of some concern there. But against Kansas City, he was pretty good. And he has played left tackle before. He's played left tackle at Boise State, and he seems to know the job that is required of him. He just needs to eliminate sort of those little lapses in concentration. Chris Jones had the sack, and Chris Jones is more of an interior lineman who line up at end, and he stunted inside and just completely sold Odhiambo on that move, and it was a really ugly sack. And I think he and Ifedi have got the same kind of issue. Play inside out. Don't give anything up on the inside. Don't let anybody come inside. Just keep everything outside, especially in Ifedi's case, because he's got the length to sort of warn people off and just sort of run them off the play. And I don't think Odhiambo's got the same length as Ifedi, but still play inside out. Just don't let anybody inside. Keep everyone on the outside. Jobs are good, unless they're being told to sort of allow that sort of interior because they want Russell Wilson to scramble out of the pocket, and it's easier to do so when there's nobody sort of, if you're not trying to contain off the edge. If someone is just sort of feigning the rush and just standing there to get Wilson if he scrambles, maybe they want them dipping outside because they want Wilson out of the pocket. I'm not sure, but that would be my recommendation for him. And he's kind of an unknown at the moment, but they drafted him in the 3rd round. They really liked him when they drafted him, so fingers crossed that he can, if nothing else. But I think if he was an average starter for the Seahawks this year, we'd all take that.
And defensively, as you were about to speak on before I rudely interrupted you, are two rookies that are definitely going to be playing big roles: Nazir Jones and Shaquille Griffin. I think both of whom don't want to be called Naz or Shaq, or maybe I'm making that up. I think Shaquille wants to be called Quill. Anyway, I don't know why I feel weird about calling him Quill, I guess. But Jones is one of only 3 defensive tackles that, right now on the roster. Of course, Bennett could slide inside, Frank Clark. There are options there, but Jones is part of that rotation right now with just Sheldon Richards and Jaron Reed. And obviously Griffin will be out there a ton, and I think has been praised by Pete Carroll and Richard Sherman and the guys that you want to be praised by, and in a way that maybe other young cornerbacks in the last 5-6 years have not quite been praised. Of course, he's the highest drafted cornerback of the Pete Carroll / John Schneider era. Delano Hill and Tedrick Thompson, the safeties, drafted in the 3rd and 4th round respectively, may not see as much playing time early on. It certainly doesn't seem like they would. But what were your thoughts on Jones and Griffin, as well as Hill and Thompson?
Yeah, really like what Jones has shown, and really excited to see what he can do, because I think he's probably going to be, especially in week 1 where they're only having 3 defensive tackles, it sounds like he's going to be on the field a fair bit. I think he's proven that he can sort of wear different hats. He can be a pass rusher. His energy is great. He's chasing down screens. He's running after the ball carrier when they've got to the 2nd level. He was all over the field. So I thought he had a really good preseason. Griffin, hard to really get a read on him too much. I can't say that there was ever any point in the preseason where you thought, wow, he's playing fantastically well here. And in the Minnesota game, it seemed like they were sort of targeting him for a safe 6 or 7 yards every time they threw in his direction. And that's really going to be the test for him. There's probably a reason why the Seahawks don't generally field rookie cornerbacks, or kind of not wanted to, and have wanted guys who've spent a lot of time in their system. And that is because you're going to get picked on. Aaron Rodgers in this game, if he sees Shaquille Griffin on the field, is probably going to throw in his general direction nearly every time, because the alternative is to throw towards Richard Sherman or throw into areas where Bobby Wagner's lurking. So, that's going to be a difficult test for him, because it's one thing and it's great. Look, don't get beat over deep. Keep everything in front of you. Just let them take it in small chunks, and let's see if they've got the patience to keep doing that all the way into the red zone. And then if they can score a touchdown, because lots of quarterbacks don't have the patience to do that. But the best of the best do. And that would be my slight concern in sort of games like this one against Green Bay, is that he might get picked on a little bit. But then I think that what they seem to be ready to do is to play Lane outside initially, and then move him inside when they want to play nickel, and have sort of Lane in the nickel, and then have Griffin outside. So they might be able to find a way to sort of mask him a little bit there, and let him sort of learn on the job. And maybe by week 6 or 7, they might feel confident enough to say he's the full-time starter outside. And as for the safeties, hard to say really, because we didn't see too much of them. I think it's pretty hard to judge Hill or Thompson. I know that some people have been critical of Thompson, but he had an interception. He had the one big mistake in the LA game, but it's a good, have that moment in preseason, so that if it ever comes up in the game, you'll know what to do it better. So I think really they were always likely to be backups, and let's just see over the next 2 or 3 years whether they can emerge into anything more.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see, because so much and so little can potentially change in the next 6 weeks. That's where we're really going to find out some of the guys that'll step up in real NFL regular season game action. And the most exciting thing right now about the Seattle Seahawks, in the second half of this show, if you stay tuned, you'll hear me talk to a Packers fan about how when the Green Bay Packers, what he really misses about the Green Bay Packers of the 90s, and some of the things that he sees other teams like the Patriots and Seahawks do today, is the Packers in the 1993 went out and got Reggie White, arguably the greatest defensive player of all time, while he still had years left in him. And then they went on and won the Super Bowl in 1996 and went back in 1997. The Seahawks, I can't compare Sheldon Richardson to Reggie White in any form, though I can say that in terms of being a dominant defensive lineman, Sheldon Richardson belongs in that conversation. And so for the best defense in the NFL, to add a player like Sheldon Richardson at their biggest weakness, how does the addition of Sheldon Richardson change the defense, and how does it potentially open up Michael Bennett, Favreau, Frank Clark, and the other guys in the front seven to adjust their games and be more effective, knowing that there's a guy like Sheldon Richardson in the 3-tech spot?
Well, it's going to be very interesting to find out, Kenny, because I think to some extent, I kind of look at this trade in 2 ways. On the one hand, it could be the next Marshawn Lynch trade, because you've got a guy who is incredibly talented, is of a certain level that there are just not many players like Sheldon Richardson, and you managed to get him for a 2nd-round pick in Jermaine Kearse. I mean, like, they got Lynch for something like a 4th and a 5th rounder or 6th rounder or something like that thrown in as well, which was an absolute steal. And Marshawn Lynch was like the 14th pick in the draft or the 12th pick in the draft when he was taken. And Sheldon Richardson was like the 13th pick in the draft. They're both really, really good players with years ahead of them. And Richardson could easily be on a level of that kind of a steal in terms of the trade, because he's got the talent to do it. But on the other hand, I kind of look at this and think, is there any chance at all, and I don't want to be negative about the trade because I love the trade, but is there any chance at all that this is just going to be the defense's answer to Jimmy Graham? Because the one thing about Graham is they took one of the most exciting, explosive playmakers in the NFL and tried to fit him into their way of doing things, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But as a consequence, Jimmy Graham has gone from being a guy who would be 1,200 yards, 15 touchdowns or 12 touchdowns a year to now doing a lot more blocking. He's not getting targeted with those one-on-one shots as much as he was. They're not going to him nearly every play. He's not the focal point of the passing game. He's a part of the offense that is also, and everything has to come together for it to work almost as one. So it's a very different way of doing things. And sort of people's expectations of Graham were nay high, and actually they are a lot lower as a consequence. And that doesn't mean that Graham's doing anything wrong or the team are doing anything wrong. It's just the expectations way up here when the Seahawks want Graham to come in and play their system and their scheme. So you're never going to get back to where it was at New Orleans. And with Sheldon Richardson, Seattle's defensive line is all about, stopping the run, doing your job, containing the gaps, and taking away the running game. And that's the modus operandi for the Seahawks, is to take away an opponent's running game. So the defensive tackles and the defensive linemen, for that matter, a large part of their responsibility is on stopping the run and putting the team in sort of third and long situations and stuff like that. That's not conducive to a relentless pass rush. And, if you played for a team like Arizona or the Jets, or the Steelers or teams like that blitz a lot, that get creative, that have linebackers moving all over the place, and you confused offensive linemen and quarterbacks, and there's kind of this like controlled chaos going on. It makes it a bit easier to sort of get sacks, rack up sacks, and make the big numbers. When you are saying, this is who we are, here's a 4-man rush, we're going to try and take on your 5 offensive linemen, it's going to be difficult to sort of get up to 10 sacks. So if people are seeing Sheldon Richardson thinking, here we go, this is our answer to Aaron Donald, he's going to get 12 sacks this year, I'm not sure if that's ever going to be true. But what I do think he's going to do is he's going to be able to play the run as well as probably, Ruben and everybody else that's played it over the last few years, because he can do that job. He is going to be disciplined, because I think he is. And he is going to offer you that little bit more pass rush on sort of first and second downs compared to someone like Ruben or Tony McDaniel that they've had in the past. So, it's a really good trade. I think, if they can get sort of 6 or 7 sacks out of him, it's perfectly acceptable. Is he going to be a 12-sack monster? I'm not too sure. Just one other final quick point on this. I think that what we see on Sunday against Green Bay is going to be very different to what we see any other week. I think it's clear with the roster decision they've made, they're only carrying 3 defensive tackles at the moment, that this is going to be a game where the Seahawks are pretty much in nickel for every single defensive snap, that they are going to try and pressure Rodgers. They're going to put Bass on the field. They're going to put, Clark, Averill, Bennett, and Richardson on the field. They are going to try and rush Aaron Rodgers. They're going to try and get pressure on him. They're going to put an extra defensive back on the field. They are going to try something different against this Green Bay team. And as soon as they get to Monday morning, I think they're going to be looking to bring another defensive tackle in, because they're going to have a very different setup when they play Tennessee and exotic smash mouth in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, and just in terms of that front seven and what, before we wrap it up and focus finally on our thoughts on this Packers game in week 1, just one other roster note, or, because the 53-man roster came out, there were certainly some surprises and at least one huge disappointment for some fans out there. But what I really want to focus on is perhaps the thing that's notable, yet at the same time, wasn't talked about at all. I feel like barely talked about over training camp and preseason. It was just sort of bandied about back and forth. But, if you had talked about Marcus Smith in the way that we had talked about Deion Jordan, maybe people would be more excited for the fact that Marcus Smith had made the team. I guess the difference is that, while Deion Jordan was the number 3 pick, Smith was only the 26th overall pick, which was in 2014 when he was drafted by the Philadelphia Eagles out of Louisville, and only had 4 sacks. Those came in the last 2 years combined. When he played for Philadelphia, but the linebacker, 6'3", 250, makes the team here, and could potentially play a role this week if Michael Wilhoit is held back at all. But even still, like you said, could be a nickel, and maybe we don't see a third linebacker very often. But for a draft podcast and for a draft guru like yourself, what are your thoughts on Marcus Smith, and do you think that he can play an important role for Seattle this season? Are you surprised that he's here?
Not surprised. I mean, but at the same time, if he'd have been cut, I don't think it would have been a major surprise either, because he didn't have a hugely impactful preseason. I know he had a injury at the start of it, didn't he? And I don't think he played in the first preseason game, but then it came back and seemed to do okay against Minnesota, I think, if memory serves. I think the thing with him is he obviously was a first-round pick for a reason, and he kind of fits a lot of what the Seahawks like in the players of this profile, and it was worth a shot. And I think it's perhaps one of those where they feel like they're not ready to give up on that particular project yet, that maybe they feel as the season develops and progresses that he could end up having that, being that sort of edge linebacker type hybrid that they've not really had since Bruce Irvin was here. And when Philadelphia drafted him, I'm pretty sure kind of the analysis was that this is Philadelphia trying to find their answer to Bruce Irvin. So, the Seahawks were not going to have a player like, Cassius Marsh was not that player. Bass is not that player. And the linebackers that they've got on the roster are not that player. So this Marcus Smith project, I think it's a decent little move for them. Let's see if he can have an impact, whether it's, whether he can be more Bruce than O'Brien Schofield, or whether, actually down the line he could end up sort of delivering on some of that first round potential. It's only 3 years since he was drafted in the first round. So, let's see what he can do this year. And it's going to come at a really nice price for the Seahawks to see if they can turn him into something. So he's going to be an interesting one to watch, see if he can have an impact this year.
Yeah. Lots of interesting guys I feel like to watch. And we're going to get some answers this Sunday as the Seahawks go to Lambeau, try and get some revenge for their 36-16 loss in Green Bay last season. It's their worst loss since 2011. And certainly they want to go in there and have a much better performance. And, with a healthy Earl Thomas, a healthy Russell Wilson, the addition of Sheldon Richardson, some of the other additions around the team. I think Luke Jokel has certainly made a positive difference on the team. Hopefully the Seattle Seahawks, and Eddie Lacy goes back to Green Bay. Hopefully they have a good showing in Green Bay. And speaking of that, let's quickly, Rob, what are your thoughts on the Green Bay Packers headed into 2017? Another year where they should stay in contention because of Aaron Rodgers, but maybe questions on the offensive line, maybe questions on the defense. What are your expectations for the Green Bay Packers, and what is your prediction for this game, Week 1, Seattle?
Well, aren't they just the complete opposite of the Seahawks, really? Because the Packers have been a contender for so many years now, since Rodgers took over from Favre. I mean, even when Favre was there, the back end of his career, they were contenders. But since Rodgers won that first Super Bowl, they've had a window that, really Aaron Rodgers is good enough to probably should have won, at least 2 Super Bowls in his career, if not looking to win it, comfortably a third or a fourth. I mean, he is one of the best quarterbacks to ever play the game. So the fact that he hasn't really got that close to winning another one, a couple of NFC Championship games, stuff like that, it's never really felt like the Packers were robbed of a title or anything. So I think that as the years have gone by, it's almost been neglectful on Green Bay that they haven't done more to support him with a team that is good enough to be a powerhouse. So hardly any trades, hardly any free agent moves, sticking with guys sometimes for too long, not drafting particularly well, having a number of busts. Ted Thompson, is going to live off the Aaron Rodgers pick forever. But at the end of the day, has he done enough to make the most of this Rodgers era? Arguably not. And then you look at the Seahawks and they're like, yeah, let's trade for Sheldon Richardson because, why not? Let's trade for Jimmy Graham. Let's trade for Percy Harvin. Let's bring Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill in. Let's do whatever it takes to give ourselves the best chance to win a title. And, if I was a Green Bay fan, I'd be thinking, why aren't we doing stuff? Wouldn't Sheldon Richardson look great in Green Bay? Why not take that risk? Why not make a few trades, be a bit more aggressive to try and win a Super Bowl? If the Packers only win the one title under Aaron Rodgers' quarterbacking, what a complete disaster that would be for them. What a waste of a great career. So I'd be quite frustrated if I was a Packers fan. And having said all that, they'll probably now go on and win the Super Bowl this year. What do I think about the game? I think I kind of need to see the Seahawks win at Lambeau before I believe it can happen. It's just one of those games. Of all the places, I can envisage the Seahawks winning in any stadium, but I just struggle to imagine them winning in Lambeau. And I think maybe that's just the last 2 games clouding my judgment a little bit. It is a tough place to go in general. But for whatever reason, Dom Capers, with his predictable defense, seems to be kryptonite for Russell Wilson. He turns the ball over it with, reckless abandon against Green Bay, and doesn't do it against any other team.
Nope. 7 interceptions, or 9 interceptions in the last 3 games against Green Bay, or something insane.
Yeah. Which is remarkable for such a conservative quarterback and accurate quarterback as Wilson is. He's not reckless, and yet Green Bay just turnover. And the other weird thing about it is that Colin Kaepernick and the 49ers would handle the Green Bay every time they played them. It was just like the read option, and they would, they would find a way to make Dom Capers' defense look like it was prehistoric, and yet the Seahawks make it look like it's thoroughly modern age. So I kind of need to see the Seahawks bossing that defense around before I believe it can happen. That's the one thing. And the other thing is that Rodgers is the most irritating quarterback to watch your team play against, because we all know what's going to happen. We should all we should all have like little sportsman's bet, a little wager on how long it's going to take for Rodgers to do a hard count and get a free play as a consequence, because you just know that he's going to do that, and either Bennett, Averill, or Sheldon Richardson is going to jump offside, and then Rodgers is going to step back and be like, "Ha! I've got a free play," and he's going to throw it 30 yards downfield, and then one of the defensive backs will either will probably consider pass interference, which will be like a 40-yard penalty then. And then, it just happens in nearly every game Rodgers plays. And it's massively frustrating to watch. And he seems to be the only quarterback in the NFL who does it week in, week out. So, I don't know. I think it'll be a lot closer than last year's game, obviously, because the Seahawks actually got their defense. And I'm hopeful that Wilson's not going to turn it over 5 times, whatever he did last time. But I have, to be perfectly honest, I'm not counting on this being a win.
Yeah.
There's other games that the Seahawks can get to their 12 wins or whatever.
Yeah, certainly not necessary for them to win in order to, a loss would not tank their season in any way, and certainly would not be indicative necessarily of how they're going to play this year. If there's one, certainly like you mentioned, if there's one week 1 game that would challenge them more than any, it's in Green Bay in week 1, a place that they have struggled. Even with Russell Wilson, even with Pete Carroll. That being said, I still think I'm always going to try and bet on the better defense, and the Seahawks have by far the better defense. And the way that things are going, when you look at their front 7 with Bennett, Averill, Richardson, and Clark, in addition to the other guys, when you look at Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright in the middle, when you look at Sherman, Chancellor, and Thomas in the secondary, I'm just gonna predict that the Seahawks win this game. Maybe it's only 21-20, maybe it's something like that. But I think, of course, they need to, if they're going to win, they need to hold the Packers underneath 24 points, and that's going to be their main goal. Aaron Rodgers isn't easily held under 24 points at home, but I think this is the best defense in the NFL. So I'm just going to pick the Seahawks to win this game. But if they do lose, certainly not the end of the world. This is, however, the end of the podcast for the return of, an episode of 3000 NFL Mock Draft, in addition to Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur. It's great to have Rob back to chat with us this week. You can follow him on Twitter at Rob Staton, and you can go to Seahawksdraftblog.com for updates not only on the Seattle Seahawks, but on college football, Lamar Jackson, the Heisman race, all that kind of fun stuff. So, make sure to consistently go to Seahawksdraftblog.com and fieldgoals.com, and stay tuned next for my interview with Josh Simpson, comedian, improviser, and we're going to talk about the Green Bay Packers, growing up with him, and what he thinks of their team and roster right now headed into this week 1 game. Thanks for listening to this half. Stay tuned for the next half.